He's standing in a dim hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above him. His shoes leave faint red prints across the polished floor. A nurse passes by without noticing. He moves slowly, almost gently, as if he's afraid to wake someone. In that moment from Joker, nothing about him feels explosive. He isn't raging. He isn't shouting. He's quiet, contained, almost careful. Earlier, you watched him force a smile in front of a mirror. You saw the way his fingers pulled at the corners of his mouth, rehearsing an expression that never quite settles naturally on his face. As Arthur Fleck laughs on a crowded bus, the sound spills out of him, at the wrong time, too sharp, too persistent. People shift away. They read the laugh as threat. But if you look closely, it lands more like a reflex than a choice. It's easy to call him unstable, dangerous. It's harder to sit with the stillness between his outbursts, the long pauses where he seems to disappear into himself, the way he watches other people as if he's studying a language he was never fully taught. His behavior unsettles, because it doesn't follow the rhythm most of us recognize. Smiles arrive at the wrong moment. Tears surface without warning. Violence erupts where conversation was expected. But disturbance doesn't automatically mean evil. Sometimes it signals something fractured beneath the surface, something that formed long before the first crime. A nervous system that reacts too fast. A mind that learned early that the world does not respond kindly. The film never hands you a clear diagnosis. It simply shows a man who cannot seem to regulate what spills out of him. When he sits alone in his apartment, shoulders slumped, television flickering against peeling wallpaper, there's no theatrical villainy. There's isolation. There's hunger for recognition. There's a longing that curdles into something harder. You watch him reach toward a fantasy of applause and acceptance, and for a moment it feels painfully human. What you're seeing may not begin with malice. It may begin with rupture. He lives in a city that moves quickly and expects emotional fluency. Small talk, polite laughter, measured responses. In those spaces, his timing never quite aligns. Where others offer brief smiles, he stares too long. Where a situation calls for silence, his laughter erupts without permission. The gap between him and everyone else widens, not through grand gestures but through small misattunements repeated over time. Social norms operate like an invisible script. Most people absorb them, early adjusting tone and posture without thinking. Arthur seems to experience those cues as something external, something he has to manually calculate. That constant effort can distort a sense of self. When every interaction feels like performance, identity begins to blur. You start to wonder whether the mask is protecting something fragile or replacing it entirely. His childhood surfaces in fragments, hints of instability, neglect, possible abuse. The details are blurred, but the emotional residue is not. When early attachment feels unsafe or unpredictable, the world can register as hostile long before it proves itself to be. Trust becomes provisional. Rejection feels inevitable. A joke at your expense doesn't land as harmless teasing. It confirms a private fear that you are fundamentally misplaced. There's also the matter of humiliation. Repeated public dismissal chips away at internal stability. Being laughed at instead of laughed with can reshape how a person approaches connection. Some withdraw. Others lean harder into the role assigned to them. If the world insists you are a punchline, you might begin to inhabit that role deliberately, turning passive shame into active performance. Control becomes seductive in that context. Not control over others at first, but control over perception. If he chooses when to laugh, when to shock, when to disturb, then at least the reaction belongs to him. The unpredictability becomes intentional. The chaos feels authored rather than endured. None of this erases the harm he causes. It simply shifts the lens from spectacle to process. Behavior that appears monstrous on the surface can develop gradually from unmet needs, distorted attachment, and chronic invisibility. The violence later in the film feels abrupt, but the internal fragmentation that precedes it unfolds quietly scene by scene. And when someone has felt unseen for long enough, being feared can start to resemble being known. As the story darkens, the performances become less tentative. The makeup settles more naturally on his face than the forced smiles ever did. The laughter no longer sounds accidental. It sounds claimed. Yet, even here beneath the painted grin, there is something strained, almost brittle. The transformation feels less like discovery and more like surrender to a role that asks nothing vulnerable of him. Patterns like this can grow from avoidance as much as aggression. When shame sits too close to the surface, it can be easier to construct a persona that cannot be wounded. When fear of rejection becomes constant, detachment can feel safer than hope. Emotional pain, especially when repeated and unacknowledged, does not always collapse inward. Sometimes it hardens outward. You can see moments where he hovers at the edge of connection. A pause before an outburst. A look that lingers a second too long. It raises a quiet question beneath the spectacle. What is he trying not to feel? Reframed this way, his actions begin to resemble an extreme attempt at control over a life that felt unmanageable. The clown becomes armor. The violence becomes punctuation in a world where he felt unheard. Instead of dissolving into invisibility, he asserts himself in the most irreversible way he can imagine. Not because destruction is inherently satisfying, but because it guarantees recognition. This does not absolve him. It does not simplify him either. Psychological difference rarely arranges itself into clean categories of villain or victim. A person can carry wounds and still inflict them. A need for meaning can twist into something devastating when no healthier outlet feels accessible. By the time he steps fully into the identity of the Joker, the shift feels less like a birth and more like a closing door. The city responds with chaos, but inside him, there is a strange stillness, as if the struggle to belong has ended, replaced by certainty. Perhaps that is what makes him unsettling. Not just what he does, but the possibility that fragmentation can masquerade as clarity. When we watch him, are we seeing evil in its pure form, or a mind that lost its balance under pressures it could not integrate? Next time, we might look at another figure who appears cold on the surface and ask what quiet negotiations are happening beneath that calm exterior.